In the autumn of 1863, as the Civil War raged across Virginia, the remote plantation, known as Thornfield Manor, stood isolated in the dense woodlands of Rappahannock County, some 15 miles northeast of the town of Washington. The estate, owned by Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood, had operated for nearly 40 years as one of the region's most profitable tobacco farms, employing over 60 enslaved workers across its 800 acres of fertile land. What distinguished Thornfield from neighboring plantations was not its size or productivity, but rather the peculiar silence that seemed to permeate its grounds. Visitors often remarked on the unusual quiet that hung over the property, broken only by the distant sound of work bells and the occasional creak of wagon wheels along the dirt paths that wound between the tobacco fields and the imposing 3-story brick manor house. Among the enslaved population at Thornfield lived a young woman named Sarah Elizabeth Carter, who had arrived at the plantation in 1858 at the age of 18. According to plantation records discovered decades later in the basement of the old Rappahannock County Courthouse, Sarah had been purchased from a failing farm in neighboring Fauquier County for the sum of $800, a price that contemporary documents suggest was considerably below market value for a healthy young woman of her age. The circumstances surrounding Sarah's arrival at Thornfield would later become the subject of considerable speculation among local historians. Unlike most enslaved individuals, who were typically assigned to fieldwork or domestic duties upon arrival, Sarah was immediately designated for what plantation records euphemistically termed special household service, a classification that appeared nowhere else in Thornfield's meticulously maintained ledgers. Colonel Blackwood, a widower who had lost his wife to consumption in 1856, maintained strict control over every aspect of plantation operations. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with graying hair and piercing blue eyes, he was known throughout Rappahannock County for his exacting standards and volatile temperament. Neighboring plantation owners often spoke of Blackwood's unusual management style, which involved personal oversight of even the most mundane daily activities. The colonel's only child, a son named Marcus, had departed for military service with the Confederate Army in 1861 and had not returned to Thornfield since his enlistment. This absence left the colonel increasingly isolated within the confines of the manor house, where he spent long hours in his study reviewing plantation accounts and corresponding with tobacco merchants in Richmond. Sarah's duties, as later pieced together from fragmentary records and oral testimony, appeared to center around the maintenance of the colonel's private quarters on the 2nd floor of the manor house. She was responsible for cleaning his study, preparing his meals, and attending to various personal needs that were never specifically detailed in any surviving documentation. What made Sarah's situation particularly noteworthy was her complete isolation from the rest of the enslaved community at Thornfield. Unlike other house servants who lived in quarters adjacent to the main residence, Sarah occupied a small room in the manor's east wing, accessible only through the colonel's private study. This arrangement, highly unusual for the time period, effectively severed her from contact with others on the plantation, except during brief, supervised visits to the kitchen for meal preparation. The overseer's daily reports, discovered in 1894 during renovation work on the old manor house, contain frequent references to Sarah's restricted movements around the plantation grounds. These documents, written in the careful script of Thomas Whitmore, Thornfield's head overseer, indicate that Sarah was prohibited from participating in the communal activities that typically provided enslaved individuals with opportunities for social interaction and emotional support. Whitmore's reports also reveal a pattern of increasingly strict surveillance of Sarah's activities. Beginning in late 1859, approximately 18 months after her arrival, the overseer began documenting Sarah's whereabouts at hourly intervals throughout each day. These entries, Typically brief notations such as SC study duties 10 a.m. or SC kitchen supervised 2 p.m. suggest a level of monitoring that far exceeded standard plantation security measures. The isolation imposed upon Sarah became even more pronounced during the winter months of 1860 to 1861, when heavy snows made travel between plantations nearly impossible. During this period, according to surviving records, Sarah's contact with the outside world was limited to occasional glimpses through the manor house windows and brief exchanges with the cook, an elderly woman named Patience, who had worked at Thornfield for over 20 years. Patience would later provide crucial testimony about Sarah's condition during this isolation period. In a statement recorded by a traveling minister in 1868, she described Sarah as having become increasingly withdrawn and fearful, often startling at sudden sounds and exhibiting what she termed a haunted look in her eyes. Patience noted that Sarah frequently appeared tired and seemed to have difficulty concentrating on simple tasks. The winter of 1861 brought additional changes to Sarah's circumstances. Colonel Blackwood, whose behavior had grown increasingly erratic following his son's departure for military service, began implementing what he called enhanced discipline protocols throughout the plantation. These new measures, detailed in his personal correspondence with a cousin in Richmond, included extended work hours, reduced meal rations, and the elimination of traditional rest periods on Sundays. For Sarah, these enhanced protocols meant even greater restriction of movement and longer hours confined to the manor house. Overseer Whitmore's reports from this period indicate that she was rarely seen outside the building for weeks at a time, leading to speculation among the other enslaved workers about her welfare and whereabouts. The spring of 1862 marked the beginning of what plantation records would later refer to as the difficult period. Sarah's health appeared to decline significantly during these months, with Patience noting in her later testimony that the young woman had lost considerable weight and often appeared to be in physical discomfort. More troubling were the changes in Sarah's behavior, which had become increasingly unpredictable. According to Patience's recollections, Sarah began exhibiting signs of extreme distress during routine activities. She would sometimes freeze in the middle of tasks, staring blankly ahead for several minutes before resuming her work without explanation. On other occasions, she would flinch violently at the sound of footsteps or voices, even when the source was clearly identified as familiar household staff. The isolation and deteriorating conditions at Thornfield were compounded by the colonel's increasingly volatile mood swings. Neighboring plantation owner William Henderson would later recall visiting Thornfield in the summer of 1862 and finding Colonel Blackwood in what he described as an agitated and suspicious state. The colonel had accused Henderson of attempting to spy on plantation operations and had demanded that he leave the property immediately. This incident, recorded in Henderson's personal diary, provides insight into the colonel's growing paranoia and social isolation. Henderson noted that Blackwood appeared to have aged considerably since their last meeting, describing him as haggard and wild-eyed, with the bearing of a man who trusts no one and sees enemies in every shadow. The autumn of 1862 brought news that would further destabilize conditions at Thornfield. Word arrived that Marcus Blackwood had been killed in action at the Battle of Antietam, leaving his father without an heir and increasingly bitter about the war's impact on his family. The colonel's response to this devastating news was to withdraw even further from social contact, refusing visits from neighbors and clergy who came to offer condolences. For Sarah, the colonel's grief manifested in increased demands for her presence and attention. Whitmore's reports from this period indicate that she was now required to remain in the manor house around the clock, with no scheduled breaks or opportunities to venture outside. The overseer noted with apparent concern that Sarah was becoming increasingly thin and pale, with a nervous disposition that seems to worsen by the day. The winter of 1862 to 1863 proved to be particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping well below normal and heavy snows blocking roads throughout Rappahannock County for weeks at a time. The isolation at Thornfield became complete during this period, with no visitors, deliveries, or communication with the outside world for nearly 2 months. It was during this isolation that the first disturbing sounds began to emanate from the manor house. According to testimony later provided by several field workers, strange noises could be heard coming from the building during the late evening hours. These sounds, described as crying or moaning by some witnesses and like furniture being moved around by others, became a source of growing concern among the enslaved community. Patients would later recount that she became increasingly worried about Sarah's welfare during this period. On the rare occasions when she encountered Sarah in the kitchen, she noticed that the young woman appeared to be in constant fear, jumping at the slightest unexpected sound and speaking only in whispers. More disturbing were the marks patients observed on Sarah's arms and neck, which she described as dark bruises that seemed to never fully heal. The arrival of spring in 1863 brought little relief to the oppressive atmosphere at Thornfield. Colonel Blackwood's behavior had become increasingly unpredictable, with violent outbursts directed at field workers and household staff becoming more frequent. Overseer Whitmore documented several incidents in which the colonel had threatened workers with physical punishment for minor infractions or imagined transgressions. It was against this backdrop of mounting tension and fear that the events of the night of April 23, 1863, would unfold. According to multiple witness accounts compiled years later, this date marked the beginning of a sequence of occurrences that would forever change the character of Thornfield Manor and the lives of all who dwelt there. The day began unremarkably, with Sarah performing her usual duties in the manor house while field workers tended to the spring planting of tobacco seedlings. Whitmore's daily report, one of the last he would file from Thornfield, noted that all activities proceeded according to normal schedules until approximately mid-afternoon, when what he described as an unusual commotion arose from the direction of the manor house. Several field workers later testified to hearing raised voices and what sounded like furniture being thrown about in the upper floors of the building. These sounds, according to their accounts, continued for approximately 30 minutes before an eerie silence settled over the plantation. When questioned about these disturbances, Whitmore reportedly told the workers to return to their tasks and avoid approaching the manor house without explicit permission. As evening approached, the usual routine of the plantation underwent a subtle but significant change. The dinner bell, typically rung at precisely 6 o'clock each evening, remained silent. Field workers waiting for the signal to end their day's labor found themselves uncertain about whether to continue working or return to their quarters. This confusion, minor though it seemed at the time, would later be recognized as the first indication that something had gone seriously wrong at Thornfield. Patients, whose responsibilities included preparing the colonel's evening meal, grew increasingly concerned as darkness fell without any summons to the manor house. In her later testimony, she described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as she approached the building's kitchen entrance, noting that the usual lamplight was absent from the colonel's study window on the second floor. Upon entering the kitchen, patients discovered that Sarah was nowhere to be found. This absence was particularly troubling because Sarah's duties typically required her to remain in the manor house at all times, especially during the evening hours when the colonel expected her to be readily available for any requests or needs that might arise. A search of the manor house's ground floor revealed no sign of either Sarah or Colonel Blackwood. The building appeared to be completely deserted, with an unsettling quiet that seemed to permeate every room. Patients would later describe the atmosphere as heavy and oppressive, as if the very air had become difficult to breathe. The discovery of the colonel's study on the second floor provided the first concrete evidence that something terrible had occurred. The room, typically maintained in perfect order according to the colonel's exacting standards, showed signs of a violent struggle. Furniture had been overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and what appeared to be bloodstains marked the walls near the window overlooking the plantation grounds. Most disturbing was the condition of Sarah's small room adjacent to the study. The space, barely large enough to contain a narrow bed and small table, bore evidence of significant disturbance. The bed had been stripped of its linens, the table overturned, and personal belongings that Sarah had accumulated during her years at Thornfield were scattered and broken throughout the confined space. Whitmore, summoned by Patience's alarmed cries, arrived at the manor house to find a scene that defied easy explanation. In his final report, filed with county authorities 3 days later, he described discovering clear evidence of violence and struggle, but noted the complete absence of both the colonel and Sarah. No bodies were found despite an extensive search of the building and immediate grounds. The investigation that followed would prove to be one of the most perplexing cases in Rappahannock County's history. Local authorities, already overwhelmed by wartime responsibilities and the chaos of military occupation, found themselves confronting a mystery that seemed to have no logical solution. The disappearance of both individuals simultaneously, leaving behind evidence of violence but no clear indication of what had transpired, challenged conventional understanding of how such events typically unfolded. Interviews with plantation workers revealed a consistent pattern of testimony regarding the events leading up to the disappearances. Multiple witnesses confirmed hearing sounds of conflict from the manor house on the afternoon and evening of April 23rd, but none reported seeing anyone leave the building or approach it from outside. This testimony suggested that whatever had occurred at Thornfield had been an entirely internal affair, involving only the building's usual occupants. The condition of the plantation following the disappearances provided additional puzzling details. Livestock remained properly tended, field tools were found in their usual storage locations, and the plantation's financial records appeared to be intact and up to date through the day of the incident. This orderly state of affairs seemed inconsistent with a scenario involving outside attackers or spontaneous abandonment of the property. Perhaps most intriguingly, searchers discovered a partially written letter in the colonel's study, apparently begun on the morning of April 23rd, but never completed. The letter, addressed to a cousin in Richmond, contained routine discussion of plantation business and tobacco prices, but ended abruptly mid-sentence with the words, "She has finally." The remainder of the page was blank, leaving readers to speculate endlessly about the colonel's intended meaning. The fate of the other enslaved individuals at Thornfield became an immediate concern for county authorities already struggling with the complexities of wartime administration. Without clear ownership or legal oversight, the plantation's operations effectively ceased, forcing workers to seek shelter and employment elsewhere in the region. Many would carry with them memories and suspicions about the events of April 23rd that would influence local folklore for generations to come. Patience, whose advanced age and long service at Thornfield made her relocation particularly difficult, remained on the property for several additional weeks before accepting shelter with a neighboring family. During this period, she reported experiencing disturbing sounds from the manor house during the nighttime hours, describing them as footsteps and voices that seemed to come from rooms that should have been empty. These reports of unexplained phenomena at the abandoned Thornfield Manor would persist for months following the disappearances. Travelers along the road that passed near the plantation frequently reported seeing lights in the manor house windows late at night, despite the building's confirmed abandonment. Some claimed to have heard what sounded like music or conversation drifting from the structure during the early morning hours. The mystery deepened in June 1863 when county officials conducting a formal inventory of the plantation discovered Sarah's personal diary hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. The diary, containing entries spanning from her arrival at Thornfield in 1858 through early April 1863, provided the first detailed insight into the true nature of her experiences on the plantation. The entries, written in Sarah's careful handwriting, revealed a pattern of abuse and control that far exceeded what investigators had initially suspected. Beginning shortly after her arrival, Sarah documented increasingly severe restrictions on her freedom of movement, escalating demands for her availability and attention, and what she described as punishments for perceived failures in her duties or attitude. More disturbing were the diary's references to the Colonel's growing obsession with controlling every aspect of Sarah's existence. Entries from 1860 and 1861 described his insistence on selecting her clothing, monitoring her consumption of food and water, and requiring detailed accounts of how she spent every moment of her time. Sarah wrote of feeling like a bird in a cage that grows smaller each day. The diary's later entries painted an increasingly desperate picture of Sarah's mental and physical condition. By late 1862, she was documenting symptoms of severe exhaustion, persistent fear, and what she described as a feeling that I am disappearing piece by piece. These entries suggested that Sarah had begun to plan some form of resistance or escape, though the specific details of any such plans were not clearly articulated. The final entry, dated April 20th, 1863, 3 days before the disappearances, contained a chilling statement of intent. Sarah wrote, "I cannot endure another day of this existence. The Colonel believes he owns not just my body, but my very soul. Tonight I will show him that some things cannot be possessed." The diary contained no further entries, leaving investigators to speculate about what actions Sarah might have planned or attempted. The discovery of the diary prompted a more intensive investigation of the manor house and surrounding grounds. Searchers looking for additional evidence or clues about the fate of the missing individuals conducted a room-by-room examination of the building, including areas that had been previously overlooked or given only cursory attention. This more thorough search revealed disturbing details about the conditions in which Sarah had been forced to live. Her small room, upon closer inspection, showed evidence of modifications that suggested it had been designed more as a prison cell than living quarters. The single window had been fitted with heavy iron bars, the door could be locked from the outside, and scratches on the walls indicated repeated attempts to mark the passage of time. Even more troubling was the discovery of a hidden chamber beneath the manor house's main staircase. This space, accessed through a concealed panel in the wall, contained items that suggested the Colonel's obsession with controlling Sarah had extended far beyond what even the diary had revealed. Among the objects found were locks of hair, pieces of clothing, and detailed written observations about Sarah's daily activities and emotional states. The hidden chamber also contained what appeared to be plans or preparations for some form of permanent confinement. Investigators discovered shackles, chains, and construction materials that seemed intended for the creation of a more secure, prison-like environment. These findings suggested that the Colonel had been planning to escalate his control over Sarah to even more extreme levels. The implications of these discoveries sent shockwaves through the local community and prompted renewed speculation about what might have occurred on the night of April 23rd. The evidence suggested a situation that had been spiraling towards some form of violent conclusion, but the absence of bodies or clear indication of the sequence of events left crucial questions unanswered. Local religious leaders and community members who had known Colonel Blackwood expressed stunned disbelief at the revelations about his treatment of Sarah. Neighbors who had considered him a respectable, if somewhat eccentric, member of the local elite found themselves questioning their previous assumptions about his character and the true nature of life at Thornfield Manor. The investigation took another unexpected turn in August 1863, when workmen clearing debris from a collapsed section of the manor house's basement made a disturbing discovery. Buried beneath fallen timbers and accumulated rubble, they uncovered what appeared to be the remnants of a makeshift grave or burial site. The grave contained the skeletal remains of an individual whose identity could not be immediately determined. The positioning of the bones and the crude nature of the burial suggested a hasty interment, possibly conducted under circumstances that required secrecy or concealment. More troubling was evidence that the burial had occurred relatively recently, possibly within the year preceding the discovery. Medical examination of the remains, conducted by the county's only available physician, revealed signs of trauma that were consistent with violence. Several bones showed evidence of breaks or fractures that appeared to have occurred around the time of death. The physician's report, filed with county authorities in September 1863, concluded that the individual had likely died as a result of severe bodily harm inflicted by person or persons unknown. The discovery of the body raised immediate questions about its relationship to the disappearances of Colonel Blackwood and Sarah. The timing and location of the burial suggested a possible connection, but the state of decomposition made positive identification impossible using the investigative methods available at the time. County officials found themselves confronting the possibility that the mystery of April 23rd might be far more complex than initially suspected. Further excavation of the basement area revealed additional troubling evidence. Hidden beneath layers of earth and debris, investigators discovered personal items that appeared to have belonged to Sarah, including jewelry and clothing fragments that matched descriptions provided by patients and other witnesses. These findings strongly suggested that at least one of the missing individuals had met with violence on the plantation grounds. The investigation also uncovered evidence of previous burial sites in the basement area. Disturbed earth and decomposed organic matter indicated that the recently discovered grave was not an isolated incident. The implications were chilling. Thornfield Manor appeared to have been the site of multiple deaths and secret burials over an extended period. These revelations prompted authorities to expand their investigation to include a review of plantation records and correspondence dating back several years. What they discovered was a pattern of unexplained disappearances and personnel changes that had gone largely unnoticed by the local community. Enslaved individuals who had been reported as sold to distant plantations or relocated for agricultural needs could not be traced to their supposed destinations. The correspondence between Colonel Blackwood and various business associates revealed additional disturbing details. Letters dating from 1861 and 1862 contained cryptic references to disciplinary matters and the need for absolute authority in household management. Some correspondents expressed concern about reports of harsh conditions at Thornfield, but these warnings appeared to have been dismissed or ignored. As autumn 1863 gave way to winter, the investigation into the disappearances and discoveries at Thornfield began to attract attention beyond Rappahannock County. Newspaper accounts of the Thornfield mystery appeared in Richmond and other Virginia cities, drawing curious visitors and amateur investigators to the abandoned plantation. The notoriety surrounding the case also brought forward additional witnesses who had previously remained silent about their knowledge of conditions at the plantation. A traveling merchant who had conducted business with Colonel Blackwood reported observing unusual restrictions on the movement of household staff during his visits. A former overseer who had worked briefly at Thornfield in 1860 described an atmosphere of fear and secrecy that had prompted his early departure. Most significantly, a minister who had occasionally visited the plantation to conduct religious services for the enslaved community came forward with disturbing observations about Sarah's condition. Reverend Isaiah Crawford testified that he had noticed signs of physical abuse and psychological distress during his encounters with Sarah, but had been prevented from speaking with her privately by the colonel's constant supervision. Reverend Crawford's testimony provided crucial insight into the timeline of Sarah's deteriorating situation. He described observing a progressive decline in her health and spirits over the course of several visits between 1860 and 1862. Most troubling was his account of their final encounter in early 1863, when Sarah had appeared to be barely clinging to sanity and hope. The minister's testimony also revealed attempts by Sarah to communicate her distress to outside observers. During one visit, she had apparently tried to pass him a written message, but had been intercepted by the colonel before the exchange could be completed. Reverend Crawford expressed deep regret about his failure to intervene more forcefully on Sarah's behalf, acknowledging that social and legal constraints of the time had limited his ability to challenge a property owner's treatment of enslaved individuals. As 1864 began, the formal investigation into the Thornfield disappearances was quietly suspended due to the demands of wartime administration and the Confederate Army's increasing need for local resources and personnel. The case file was archived in the county courthouse with a notation that it remained unresolved pending the availability of additional investigative resources. The abandonment of the official investigation did not, however, end local interest in the mystery. Thornfield Manor, now standing empty and increasingly deteriorated, became a source of fascination and fear for residents of Rappahannock County. Tales of unexplained phenomena at the site continued to circulate, with some visitors reporting encounters with what they described as the sound of a woman weeping or footsteps in empty rooms. The property itself gradually fell into ruin as the Civil War continued to disrupt normal economic and social life in Virginia. The tobacco fields returned to wilderness, outbuildings collapsed from neglect, and the manor house began to show signs of structural decay. By 1865, Thornfield had become a haunting reminder of the violence and suffering that had occurred within its boundaries. In the years following the war's end, various attempts were made to settle the legal questions surrounding ownership of the abandoned plantation. Colonel Blackwood's extended family members emerged to claim the property, but disputes over inheritance and the unclear circumstances of his disappearance prevented any resolution. The land remained in legal limbo, effectively preventing any new development or habitation. The passage of time gradually reduced public interest in the Thornfield mystery, though local residents continued to share stories and speculation about the events of April 1863. These oral traditions, passed down through families and community gatherings, kept alive the memory of Sarah's suffering and the colonel's mysterious fate. In 1894, more than 30 years after the disappearances, renovation work on the old Rappahannock County Courthouse led to the rediscovery of the archived case files. A young clerk named Robert Mills, tasked with organizing old records, became fascinated by the Thornfield documents and began conducting his own investigation into the long cold case. Mills's research led him to interview surviving witnesses and community members who had knowledge of the events. Though many of the principal figures had died in the intervening decades, he was able to locate several individuals who provided additional details and perspectives on the mystery. Most notably, he found Patience's niece, who had preserved oral accounts of her aunt's experiences and observations at Thornfield. The renewed interest in the case prompted Mills to visit the ruins of Thornfield Manor, which by 1894 had deteriorated into a skeleton of its former grandeur. Much of the structure had collapsed or been reclaimed by vegetation, but the basement area remained partially accessible. It was during this exploration that Mills made one final disturbing discovery. Hidden in a crevice in the basement wall, Mills found a small metal box containing what appeared to be Sarah's final written words. The message, scratched onto a piece of metal with a sharp object, read, "If anyone finds this, know that I chose my own ending rather than let him destroy what remained of my soul. I pray that God forgives what I had to do." The message was unsigned, but appeared to be written in the same hand as the diary entries. This discovery provided the first clear indication of what might have transpired on the night of April 23, 1863. Sarah's message suggested that she had indeed planned and executed some form of resistance against Colonel Blackwood, possibly resulting in his death and her own demise. The violent evidence found in the manor house and the hidden burial sites began to form a coherent, if tragic, narrative. Mills documented his findings in a detailed report that was submitted to county authorities in 1895. His conclusions, based on the accumulated evidence and testimony, suggested that Sarah had reached a breaking point in her ability to endure the Colonel's abuse and had taken desperate action to end her torment. The specific details of what had occurred remained uncertain, but the general outline of a final, violent confrontation seemed clear. The report also addressed the question of the multiple burial sites discovered in the manor's basement. Mills theorized that Sarah had not been the Colonel's only victim, and that her action on April 23rd had been motivated not only by her own suffering, but also by knowledge of previous deaths that had occurred at Thornfield. This interpretation cast her final act as one of both desperation and justice. The publication of Mills's findings in a local historical journal in 1896 marked the last formal attempt to understand the events at Thornfield Manor. While questions about specific details remained unanswered, the broader narrative of abuse, resistance and violent resolution had been established through careful documentation and analysis of the available evidence. The ruins of Thornfield continued to deteriorate through the early decades of the 20th century, gradually disappearing beneath undergrowth and the natural reclamation of the land. By 1920, little remained visible of the plantation buildings except for portions of the manor house's stone foundation and scattered debris from collapsed structures. Local residents, however, continued to avoid the area, particularly during evening hours when unexplained sounds and phenomena were still occasionally reported. These ongoing accounts of supernatural activity ensured that the memory of Sarah's suffering and the violent events of April 1863 remained alive in community consciousness, even as the physical evidence of the plantation faded from view. The story of Sarah Elizabeth Carter and the dark secrets of Thornfield Manor serves as a stark reminder of the horrors that could unfold within the institution of slavery, where absolute power over human beings created opportunities for cruelty that defied comprehension. Her final act of resistance, though born of desperation and leading to tragedy, stands as a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be completely broken, even under the most extreme circumstances. The mystery of exactly what transpired during those final hours at Thornfield Manor died with its participants on that April night in 1863, but the documentation of Sarah's suffering, preserved in her diary, and the testimony of witnesses, ensures that her story continues to serve as both a historical record and a warning about the depths of human cruelty and the price of unchecked power over the vulnerable. Today, the land where Thornfield Manor once stood has returned to forest, with no visible trace of the buildings that once housed such suffering and violence. Occasional hikers and local historians still visit the site, guided by old maps and the faint remnants of the plantation's road system. Most find nothing but trees and undergrowth, yet some continue to report an indefinable sense of unease, as if the earth itself retains memory of the pain that once unfolded above it. The legacy of the Thornfield case extends beyond its immediate tragedy to illuminate broader questions about power, justice, and human dignity that remain relevant to contemporary society. Sarah's story reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals retain the capacity to choose their own fate, even when those choices come at the ultimate cost. The incomplete historical record ensures that many details of Sarah's life and death will remain forever unknown. We cannot fully understand the daily reality of her experience or the specific circumstances that drove her to her final desperate action. But the evidence that does survive paints a clear picture of systematic abuse and the inevitable consequence of treating human beings as property to be controlled and exploited without limit. In the end, the mystery of Thornfield Manor stands not as an unsolved puzzle to be definitively resolved, but as a testament to the complexity of human experience and the lasting impact of historical injustice. Sarah Elizabeth Carter's name appears in no official monuments or historical markers, yet her story, preserved in fragmentary records and oral tradition, continues to speak across the centuries about courage, suffering, and the ultimate assertion of human dignity in the face of absolute oppression. The silence that once characterized Thornfield Manor has been replaced by the natural sounds of the forest that has reclaimed the land. But for those who know its history, that silence remains pregnant with memory, carrying forward the story of a young woman who refused to accept the complete destruction of her humanity, even when resistance meant embracing an uncertain and violent end to her suffering. The archives of Rappahannock County were quietly sealed in 1962, exactly 100 years after Sarah's final diary entry. County officials, citing space constraints and the sensitive nature of certain historical materials, transferred the Thornfield case files to a restricted collection that would remain closed to public access for an additional 50 years. This decision effectively ended scholarly interest in the case for several decades. The few historians who had maintained research into 19th-century plantation life found themselves unable to access primary source materials that had previously been available. The story of Sarah Elizabeth Carter began to fade from academic discourse, surviving primarily in local oral traditions and occasional references in broader studies of slavery in Virginia. The restriction of the archives coincided with the final disappearance of Thornfield Manor's physical remains. A severe storm in 1961 had toppled the last standing sections of the manor house foundation, and subsequent winters had scattered even these remnants beneath layers of fallen leaves and new growth. By 1965, no trace of the plantation buildings remained visible to casual observers. Local development pressures in the 1970s brought renewed attention to the former Thornfield property. A proposed residential subdivision required environmental and archaeological surveys of the land, leading to the first systematic examination of the site since Mills's investigation in the 1890s. The survey team, unaware of the property's dark history, initially treated the project as routine documentation of colonial-era agricultural land use. The archaeological work quickly revealed anomalies that defied easy explanation. Ground-penetrating radar detected unusual subsurface features in the area where the manor house had once stood, including what appeared to be filled chambers or cellars that extended deeper than typical colonial construction would have warranted. More disturbing were the repeated discoveries of human remains scattered throughout the survey area. The project was quietly suspended when the number of discovered burial sites exceeded anything that could be explained by normal plantation cemetery practices. County authorities, now aware of the site's connection to the 19th century disappearances, classified the findings as potentially sensitive historical materials requiring further study. The proposed development was cancelled, and the land was designated as historically significant, effectively preventing future commercial use. The archaeological findings were never made public in detail, but their existence became known to a small circle of local historians and government officials. These individuals, bound by confidentiality agreements and institutional discretion, maintained silence about the true extent of what had been discovered beneath the former Thornfield grounds. The land was quietly purchased by the state of Virginia and designated as protected forest, ensuring that its secrets would remain undisturbed. In 1998, the 50-year restriction on the Thornfield archives expired, making the case files available to researchers for the first time in decades. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, a historian specializing in antebellum Virginia social history, became the first scholar to conduct comprehensive research into the newly accessible materials. Her findings, published in a limited academic journal in 2001, provided the most complete analysis of the case to date. Dr. Whitfield's research confirmed many of the conclusions reached by Robert Mills in the 1890s, while adding new insights based on more sophisticated analytical methods. Her examination of Sarah's diary revealed evidence of systematic psychological manipulation that exceeded even the abuse documented in the original investigation. The patterns of control and isolation described in Sarah's writings, Whitfield argued, represented one of the most extreme examples of individual victimization within the slavery system found in historical records. Perhaps most significantly, Whitfield's analysis suggested that Sarah's final act had been carefully planned over an extended period rather than an impulsive response to immediate crisis. The diary entries from early 1863 revealed subtle references to preparation and planning that previous investigators had overlooked. Sarah had apparently spent weeks or months developing a strategy for confronting Colonel Blackwood, suggesting a level of determination and courage that transcended desperate reaction. The implications of this interpretation cast Sarah's story in a new light, transforming her from a tragic victim who had reached a breaking point into a strategic actor who had chosen to resist her oppression despite understanding the likely consequences. This perspective aligned with broader scholarly trends toward recognizing the agency and resistance strategies employed by enslaved individuals, even within the most restrictive circumstances. Dr. Whitfield's work also addressed the question of the multiple burial sites discovered during earlier investigations. Her analysis of plantation records and correspondence suggested that Thornfield had served as a destination for enslaved individuals who had been deemed problematic by owners on other properties. This interpretation explained both the unusually high mortality rate at the plantation and Sarah's apparent knowledge of previous deaths that had motivated her final action. The publication of Whitfield's research sparked brief academic interest in the Thornfield case, but broader public attention remained limited. The story of Sarah Elizabeth Carter, while compelling to specialists in 19th century history, seemed too distant and too dark to capture contemporary imagination. The case remained an obscure footnote in the larger narrative of American slavery, known primarily to scholars and local history enthusiasts. This scholarly neglect began to change in 2015, when genealogical research conducted by a descendant of patients revealed new documentation related to the case. Family records preserved for over 150 years contained letters and testimony that had never been included in official investigations. These materials provided the most intimate and detailed account of conditions at Thornfield Manor ever discovered. The newly discovered documents included a letter written by Patience to her sister in 1864, describing her experiences at Thornfield and her observations of Sarah's treatment. The letter, written in simple but powerful language, conveyed the daily reality of Sarah's existence with an immediacy that formal investigation reports had lacked. Patience's description of Sarah's progressive deterioration, her attempts to maintain hope despite overwhelming circumstances, and her gradual recognition that resistance might be her only option, provided crucial emotional context to the factual record. Most remarkably, the family archive contained what appeared to be a copy of a letter that Sarah had managed to smuggle to Patience shortly before the events of April 23rd. This letter, previously unknown to investigators, revealed Sarah's specific plans and her reasoning for the action she intended to take. The document provided the clearest insight yet available into Sarah's mental state and motivations during her final days. In the letter, Sarah wrote, "I have lived as less than human for so long that I have forgotten what freedom feels like. But I remember what dignity means, and I will not surrender the last piece of myself to his cruelty. Whatever happens, I will choose my own path, even if that path leads to darkness. Future generations must know that some of us refuse to be broken completely." The discovery of this letter fundamentally changed scholarly understanding of the Thornfield case. Sarah emerged not as a victim driven to desperate action, but as a conscious resistor who had made a deliberate choice to sacrifice her life rather than accept complete dehumanization. Her action represented not surrender to despair, but assertion of human agency in circumstances designed to eliminate all possibility of self-determination. Contemporary historians now recognize the Thornfield Manor case as one of the most well-documented examples of individual resistance within the slavery system. Sarah Elizabeth Carter's story serves as a powerful reminder that even under conditions of absolute oppression, human beings retain the capacity to choose their response to circumstances beyond their control. The land where Thornfield Manor once stood remains protected forest today, visited occasionally by historians, genealogists, and others drawn to understand this dark chapter of American history. The Virginia Department of Historical Resources has placed a small, discreet marker near the site, acknowledging its significance without sensationalizing the tragic events that occurred there. The marker reads simply, "In memory of Sarah Elizabeth Carter and all those who suffered at this site." Their stories remind us that human dignity survives even the darkest chapters of our history. No details of the specific events are provided, leaving visitors to discover the fuller story through their own research and reflection. The mystery of exactly what transpired during the final hours at Thornfield Manor died with its participants on that April night in 1863. But Sarah's letters, diary, and the testimony of witnesses ensure that her choice to resist, despite its ultimate cost, continues to speak across the centuries about courage, human dignity, and the power of individual agency even under the most oppressive circumstances. Her story serves as both historical documentation and enduring testament to the truth that while physical freedom can be taken away, the human spirit's capacity to choose its response to suffering cannot be completely destroyed. In choosing resistance over submission, Sarah Elizabeth Carter claimed a victory that transcends the tragic circumstances of her death and continues to inspire recognition of the fundamental humanity that no system of oppression can ultimately erase.